Hey, glad to see you today. I thought I would share with you a Bible study that we used with our young adults on Tuesday night. We were online using one of Faith Life groups in their video chat, and it worked pretty well, but the subject was one that was very compelling and certainly made us think about the situation we're in now. If you're wondering, I am in my office. I got a door where I can come in by myself, keeping everything else closed off. And like a lot of people, we're just being isolated from one another, hopefully not to spread this CV-19 that's going around, nor contract it for that matter. And there are a lot of people who are being pretty fearful about this. Fear has a couple of different sides to it. There's the side that's good. It's a God-given emotion, so there's a God-given use for it. We're supposed to fear the Lord. And the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Jesus even warns us that we need to make sure that we're fearing the right person. Rather than fearing men who can do little to us, we need to make sure we fear God who has full control over us. But there is that idea of fear in the scriptures as well, of just being guarded and making sure that you're using your best practices in hygiene, in health, to make sure that you are good. But there is that overwhelming kind of fear that we're warned about in scriptures, that overwhelm us, that can incapacitate us, and just really weigh us down. If you're wondering, this is a one-take shot, so mistakes and all, you get it here. I just have a camera in here, turned it on, sitting down, and sharing with you. So I hope that this is something that is helpful for you at all. We're basing this study on an old book called None of These Diseases. You can, if you find a copy, if you might have one on your shelf, you can read through that first chapter. We're just going to cover the preface in the first chapter today. Now, S.I. McMillan wrote this back in 1963, which means that me, an old guy, was only not probably even one when it was first published. By the time I read it in its, I think, 26th printing in 1981, it had already sold over 1 million copies. And so this hit a chord with our nation back then, and I think it's hitting a chord with those that have already started studying it with me right now. Now, in his preface, Dr. McMillan said, peace just doesn't come in a capsule. He wished he could just extend that sense of peace to people, but he says he's just not able to do so. And he felt that in his practice over the years, that he was really treating a lot of what he would call the symptoms of the real problem. He felt a lot of the things that he was treating were really emotionally based diseases. Now you understand, he was writing back in the 60s as his practice extended back into the 40s and 50s. And medical practices and things have changed a little bit since then, but there's that still common agreement that there's sociosomatic problems. He talked about fear and sorrow and envy and resentment and hatred as being root causes that brought about diseases in people that he was having to try to treat. And he wasn't able to help them solve the real problem. So he wrote this book to extend to all of those patients what he really wished he could have told them at the time. You might be wondering what diseases he's talking about. And he gave a short list in that preface. He said high blood pressure, toxic goiter, Goiter, which is a thyroid disorder, migraines, headaches, arthritis, apoplexy, heart trouble, ulcers. And he said really the list is just too numerous to put down, and so he stopped there. He says physicians get to treat them, but just not that cause. And so I just asked the question, just in reflection on that, saying, well, how do people go about treating their emotionally based diseases today? The response I got from our Bible study group earlier was, self-medication. There are a lot of people who are drinking or they're being obsessive about something. They get, drugs, something going on. They then try to help themselves through those difficult times, dealing with stress or dealing with anxiety, and hopefully that will help. Rarely does that help at all. In fact, it's usually the opposite, causes more trouble. Other people do go to doctors of one sort or another, trying to find some sense of relaxation, some sense of health. There's even a lot of talk right now about mindfulness, or there are other people just saying relaxing or meditation. There are all kinds of things that people are trying to do to help them, but that still doesn't resolve the main issues, and really the Bible has the right prescription that we take. Now, some of the examples that he was using of talking about situations in which strong emotions were so strong, they were able to cause diseases. He gave about 5 of them. He said, just think about a man who enters into a situation in which he loses his life savings, not able to care for himself, not able to care for anyone else, and just the emotional impact that would have on someone. And he had witnessed that have these secondary diseases that he had to treat. So think about a woman who was jilted, and that's his word. He didn't give the context or the situation, but someone who's in a relationship and they think there's hope and there's promise, and then they get set aside, and their hopes are dashed in that sense. It wouldn't be just woman, it could be a man as well. But whenever our hopes and our dreams come to an end, our emotions are in upheaval. And so it is causing a strong emotion. It could cause those sociomatic kinds of diseases. He talked about a young father with an inoperable cancer and the impact on him and his family and how he had to treat those like that. Or often a woman whose husband is a philanderer. Again, one of those old words. It means he just wasn't faithful. In the heartache and the sorrow and the emotions that builds up in the woman who has an unfaithful husband. He also talked about a distraught teenager who had visible birthmarks, and because of that, was not able to really go through those teenage angst years very well, just hurting and being overcome by not being able to fit in, worrying about what people thought about him, having that poor self-esteem that brings up emotions and weighs them down. And he also just said about the schemer who lies awake at night thinking of ways to get even with those around them, that idea of resentment. And like I had said earlier, he wrote this book out of desire to tell anyone in these situations or other kind of situations that there's something better for them than a pill to get them through it. At the end of his preface to this book, leading into it, he talked about the promise that God made to Israel as they were being brought out of Egypt. In particular, he said there were lots of diseases that were known in the days of Egypt when Israel was there because of their various kinds of treatments that were very poor, their lack of medical knowledge, their medical procedures that they did use that caused more harm. And he said to Israel, the promise to Moses was, if you listen to my statutes and you put them into practice, you'll have none of these diseases. And that's found in Exodus 15:26. You can make sure that online that you can download the outline, the notes that I'm using right here on my tablet. You can have them go along with me. Then you can add to them. The problem with this one is you just don't get to ask the questions and respond to it. This is not like that group session that I had with the young adults where they were able to respond back and forth. But I wanted to get this out to you and hopefully encourage you that God's Word is at work and He is helping us through here. Now you get to chapter 1, and it's just a very short few pages, almost more devotional than we might think of a chapter today. But he began it by talking about some of the Egyptian remedies, and he found those in a Papyrus Eberus, which was dated to 1552 BC, and it contains a lot of their medical treatments. He didn't list all of them, but he said that there are some that you might want to take a look at and see if this kind of thing can help you. First of all, he addressed those who were trying to deal with graying hair. I guess graying hair can cause a lot of emotions in some people. When we brought it up, says, graying hair is easy. You just talk to Miss Clairol and she takes care of it for you. Well, they didn't have that option back then, and so they had a mixture that they used of calf blood and snake oil, and you would put that together, and evidently that was their solution for graying hair. We don't know if it really worked or not, but that was their medical treatment for it. Or for a lot of people, you can certainly, with me, people who are losing their hair, that brings up a lot of emotions for people looking for some kind of a treatment, a lot of angst. Well, they had their solution too. you applied the fat of several animals, and they talked about the crocodile and the hippo and all these various animals, and you'd gather fats from them, and you'd put them together, and you'd make this ointment, and you'd put it on your hair. And evidently, I don't know if it worked or not, probably not any better than a lot of the things that are used today, although there are now some medical treatments that seem to show some promise, helping a number of people out in that area of their life. Also, there was a hairdressing for the queen to really make her look good, which was used with the heel of a greyhound and date blossoms and a donkey hoof that was all boiled into oil and put on her hair. And evidently it made it, I don't know, look better. But it could also, I don't know if there's a smell with it. It didn't talk about that part of it, but sounds like there might be. But then getting on to maybe some more medical treatments, like if you got bit by a poisonous snake, how would you treat it? We know how we would treat it, but their solution was to take water that had been poured over an idol and then collected, an idol being something they worshipped, and then you would administer that water to the person who'd been bitten by a snake, and I can imagine how that would help them at all. I think that would be pretty difficult. Since this is a normal time of just studying the Bible, I often do it with a cup of coffee, so I hope that you're joining me and just having a little study here together in that. The one that he brought up that I really caught our attention was embedded splinters. Now, I've never had one that I had to go to the doctor for, but I've had lots of splinters in my hand. They've gotten infected. I finally dig them out. Have to get rid of the pus. Usually rubbing alcohol or peroxide or something like that to get it all cleaned out. Open it up and then finally get rid of the infection on it. But this was their solution for that. You would take a mixture of worm's blood. Now, I don't know what kind of worms have this blood they're talking about, but you take worm's blood, and then you would take some donkey dung, and a lot of their remedies used lots of variety of different kind of dung, and they would use that, and they would rub it on that open wound that was already infected. He mentions, he goes, well, there's no wonder why they had such an outbreak of lockjaw back then, because of all of the bacterial problems that are going on in that particular mixture. The remedy was definitely worse than anything else. And he just said there was just more and more of that sort of thing. And he just said there's no wonder why the Egyptians had so many diseases, because they just didn't have any medical insight. And they were one of the leading nations at the time, and they were touted as having some of the best medicine available in that ancient culture for those around them. And if this is an example of it, no wonder they had a lot of diseases. And if the Egyptians had been living with them, they were probably following their examples as well. And so the Israelites themselves probably had a lot of these diseases that the Egyptians were suffering with. He brings up the point that Moses was trained in all the ways of the Egyptians as he was raised up in Pharaoh's household. And so he would have learned, or at least been familiar with, a lot of these Egyptian medical remedies. And so I just kind of keep that in mind, that was the kind of education that Moses would have gotten. And just sort of ask yourself, if you had grown up with bad advice, I mean, how hard is it to let go of the bad advice and take on new advice? Most of us, it's pretty hard to let go of the things that we grew up with, or the remedies that we grew up with, that are really not helpful, that are really just common wisdom that really don't have any scientific basis. I know there are some that do help, and I don't want to impinge any of that, but I'm particularly talking about the ones that are not beneficial, the ones that are not helpful, the ones that might cause more problems than good. And that's what he was talking about. And so there's this deal that gets made between God through Moses to the Israelites, saying, hey, when I get you out of Egypt, I want you to follow my standards. And if you do, then these diseases are going to go away. And that's an amazing promise. One that all of us want to hear whenever we're dealing with our own diseases and our own fears about getting diseases. we want to hear those promises from God, that He will be with us and He'll watch over us and He'll guard us. But in particular for Moses and them, he was asking for their obedience in letting go of those things that were not good for them and taking up what He would direct them to do. In particular, Macmillan quotes Exodus 15:26, which says, He said, if you will give earnest heed to the voice of the Lord your God, Moses speaking, and do what is right in His sight, and give ear to His commandments, and keep His statutes, I will put none of these diseases on you, which I have put on the Egyptians, for I, the Lord, am your healer. You can also find a similar one in Deuteronomy, the 7th chapter, verse 15, that says, the Lord will remove from you all sickness, and He will not put on you any of the harmful diseases of Egypt which you have known, but He will lay them aside. Of course, the phone rings, right? So going back to Deuteronomy 7:15, the Lord will remove from you all sickness, and He will not put on you any harmful diseases of Egypt, which you have known, but He will lay on them all who hate you. And in Deuteronomy, the 28th chapter, verse 60, He will bring back on you all the diseases of Egypt, of which you were afraid, and they will cling to you. Basically saying, if you don't follow me, they're going to come back. Usually, if you've ever gotten involved in a Bible reading plan and you start at Genesis and you're trying to work your way through, you'll get yourself to this part of the Bible, and that's when you start slugging through it. You know, you get into Leviticus and Exodus, especially Leviticus, and all these rules and commandments and things about what you can eat and you can't eat, and how you're supposed to wash stuff and you can't wash stuff, and how you're supposed to do things and take care of stuff. And we just go like, oh man, that is killing me. Skip on to something better. You know, I want to read about Samson, and better the stories about Noah or Moses leading them out. Anything but all these rules and regulations. And in the New Testament, you know, we're sort of set apart from them. We're saved by God's grace, but there's some great truths in the Old Testament, and particularly relating to His call and His promise of not having any of these diseases. So think about this. Even though we find this list of medical directions in Leviticus, God was definitely not copying from the wisdom of the ancient world. From what you find in Leviticus, it's very different than the kinds of things that you find in like the Papyrus Ibris, what we were reading earlier. Otherwise, we would have stuff in the Bible that says, oh, you need to grind up this bone and mix it with that blood and add in this dung. And you just don't find anything like that in the Scriptures. It's devoid of harmful practices. And it contains a lot of details for things that are very positive and helpful and beneficial for us instead. The Israelites, certainly like everyone else, got a little legalistic with it. But the general tenor of it is a pretty healthy living. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that even though Moses grew up under that education system and had learned all of these Egyptian practices, he did not give in, if he was tempted, to add any of it into it. It's not Egyptian wisdom, and Moses didn't add it into it. He was willing to take what God directed to him and pass it along and say, hey, these are the kinds of things that we ought to be doing. Now, the first example that Macmillan gives about a disease that has a biblical solution to it is leprosy. He mentions that it killed millions of people in Europe. The breakouts in Europe around the 6th and 7th century, then peaking in the 13th and 14th century. He says, now I didn't fact check him, but he says that it caused more death than the Black Plague of the 14th century and more deaths than the breakout of syphilis in the 15th century. And so there were a lot of deaths related to it, and it was spreading contagion. And the societies at the time didn't know how to stop its spread. They certainly didn't have a solution for it. A friend of mine gave me this link to a visualization of various diseases throughout history. The link's on the notes that I have online, so if you get on there, you can go to it yourself. But it goes all the way back, all the way up to present. Includes things like the Spanish flu and the Russian flu and yellow fever, cholera, HIVs, all the way up to CV-19, and just comparison, swine flu, all those kinds of things. It just gives it a visualization of how what we're experiencing today compares to things that have gone on in the past. Fortunately, we've got better physicians, better understanding of how things work than they did back when leprosy was spreading across medieval Europe. In fact, back then, the physicians weren't even sure how it was going from one person to another. Even though in the Old Testament there was this idea of contagion, they were still contributing to its spread to things like eating spicy foods or peppers or garlic or eating the meat of diseased hogs. Now, I don't know what you'd get from eating the meat of a diseased hog. Not good, but it wasn't leprosy. Some even attributed the spread of the diseases to the misalignment of the planets. There's always bad theology and poor thinking whenever something out like this is going along. I've heard it about CV-19. There are some people who are talking about it as if this was a scourge, a judgment of God on some particular group of people or on the world itself. My understanding is that God loves the world, and He's continuing to put things in place to help us, despite the fact that there is disease and death. He is on our side, and we can put our hope and trust in Him for things. There are also people who are saying that, well, this is all a matter of faith. If you just have really strong faith and God is going to protect you, they go back to those scriptures like in Mark where it says they'll, get bitten by snakes and it won't affect them. And certainly we have the example of that when Paul was shipwrecked and the viper bit him and he didn't get sick. So there are some promises, there are some fulfillments of that kind of thing. But in general, we don't have that fulfillment, that kind of promise for all diseases and all places and all ways. God sends to work with us individually, bringing about what He wants in each of our lives. Even Paul, who was freed from that poison, himself had his thorn in the flesh, whatever that was. There's some people who think it was his vision and lack of being able to see, that he prayed to be healed. And he never was of that. And he said, it's God's way of keeping me humble. So even for Paul, there were things in his life that God didn't intervene and take away from him. And so we have to remember that God is dealing with each one of us. He's doing it individually, and He's doing it for our good because He longs for us to turn to Him and to enjoy the benefits of having a God who gives us the hope of heaven. Now, the second example that Macmillan used is the Black Plague. It killed 1 in 4 people in Europe at the time it was spreading, a total of some 60 million people. The descriptions of it are horrific. They were stacking up bodies. The physician would be cast in the same pit that they were doing just to have mass burials, hoping that they could stem the tide of its spread. It just sounded horrific of it. And what finally controlled these infectious diseases of leprosy and the Black Plague, and in particular, is that the church was given sort of leadership. It might have been by default, and granted, medieval church leadership was not always stellar, but they were able to do a lot of good things. And in this case, they drew on the concept of contagion from the Old Testament. They understood how God had limited Israel in the spread of leprosy. And so they put in civil directions to address it the same way. The Old Testament directs on how to identify what leprosy is and not confuse it with something else. Once the condition of leprosy was well established, then that patient was segregated. They were excluded from the community, which might sound very harsh, but it did stem the spread of this terrible disease. If the person symptoms went away. There was a process to re-enter them back into society. But there's a lot of teaching in there, especially in Leviticus, the 13th chapter. I should read a couple of verses to you from it. The leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head hang loose. He shall cover his upper lip and cry out, unclean, unclean. He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone, and his dwelling shall be outside of the camp. It was an effective means. Now, just to let you know, there's still leprosy today. It's still spreading. In fact, I checked on the World Health Organization, and there's over 200,000 new cases of leprosy every year still today, mostly in India and Africa, but there's still some of it here in the U.S., and one of the primary ways that they're doing it is still isolating these people. There are medications that are being used that have shown some positive treatment to deal with the symptoms of it. But for the most part, these people are set aside in their communities for a long time because they are contagious with it. I'm not up on the new medical treatments for it, but I'm hoping that they're far advanced and there's help for people who do catch it and that they're able to get to that help. But it does bring up the question, and McMillan brought this up, is this still an effective means of controlling infectious diseases? Is a sanitary and quarantine legislation like we're undergoing right now, which is based on the Bible, whether our government understands it or realizes it or not, is this really the best approach? Our civil leaders are debating, how long do we do this? Is this cure better than what the results would be otherwise? And by that, they're saying our economy is being devastated. There are people who are losing their jobs. We've gone from overflowing and very abundant to really struggling. This is going to impact lots and lots of people for a long time. They're going through a stimulus package now. For trillions of dollars. It started out with $1 trillion, now it's up to $2 trillion because, it's politics. And so they say, well, I'm not going to vote for it unless you add this, or you add that, or you add this, or you add this. And pretty soon it's a big pork barrel. And I'm sure as the details come out from this impact, and I'm hoping it really does help people, we're going to find a lot of stuff that got shoved into it by our politicians that are going to make us sick. So I hope that it's overall a good thing for our country and for those who are going to be suffering as a result of this quarantine. But I hope that the quarantine really does stem the tide of the infectious disease. And we might even wonder how much and how far would it spread if we didn't put these in place. Now his conclusion to this chapter was, if the plagues had been left unabated, as I was just hinting at, many of the celebrities of the Renaissance era may not ever have been born. And so he's saying, well, you just think what would happen if we didn't put quarantine laws into effect, if we didn't self-isolate. How fast would it spread? Who would catch it? How many people would die? We don't want to be in that area. But getting toward the end of this, I just asked the question of what was missing from this chapter, from this study. One of the things I thought was missing is that God does not provide a cure for the disease, just directions to limit the spread. Discussing the why could take us forever. I know if we'd come to a conclusion, we'd probably end up going to Job and listening to him have everything in his life and being diseased, and his friends saying, you just need to curse God. He's not a real caring God if all this stuff is happening to you. It's well worth your read of Job to get to that answer that says, I'm going to trust him, I'm going to be faithful to him, and he is going to see me through this. And we have to have that faithfulness that God is looking out for us and he is directing our paths, whether we get disease or we don't get disease or not. And another thing I thought was missing in this chapter is that he didn't really address the fact that while he started by saying that there were emotionally based diseases that he wasn't able to address and wanted to, he went to these two examples which were not emotionally based diseases. They're not the result of poor hygiene. The spreading of them might be. They're not the result of terrible medical advice like they had in Egypt, although there might be some that's out there. He didn't address that. But I think he was trying to make the point that there are biblical principles that deal with real world problems, even something so bad as a contagious disease for which we don't have a medical cure, that there is still biblical principles that give us a best practice that's still our best practice. So we can trust the scriptures. Some of these last things I was talking about that's not in there, it's not in the chapter, is the origin of disease or death. Man is not discussed in our role in causing harm in the world. And now, regardless of your take on the historical nature of the Old Testament, it really does make it clear that man is responsible for bringing disease and death into the world because of our sin. And we have a negative impact on the world around us. Whether it's sin individually or collectively, we often hurt the world around us. Even in the book of Romans, Paul proclaims that creation itself is longing for that day when it gets redeemed and is no longer under the constraints of the sin that we bear upon it. At the same time, with that said, we're also put as stewards of this world. And so we can have a positive impact on the world around us. And we often do. We often care for the world and care for our society in ways that makes a positive and good difference. We struggle against the diseases. We are able to make impacts and inroads to help people in their health, as well as take care of the world around us. We can make a difference, and we should be making a difference as we fulfill our roles as good stewards of God's creation, even in its fallen state. But also in here that I thought was missing, the primary thing that was missing in this chapter, is there's no mention of the New Testament anywhere in it. Now, in Jesus' day, they were still isolating lepers. They were putting them off. But it was Jesus who had encountered several of these lepers, and he healed them. He did what no one else could do. There was no cure for leprosy, and Jesus was able to heal them by his word, demonstrating not only his compassion, but also his identity as the Son of God, who had come to take away the sins of the world, who had come to do something even more miraculous than healing the leper. Regardless of whether you have a disease and it's healed by God, or whether he doesn't heal your disease, as mentioned a couple of times in the case of Paul. He was an apostle who was able to heal lots of diseases through his ministry, especially when he was in the town of Ephesus. And he was able to recover from that snake bite that he had on there, sort of fulfilling that role that we hear about in Mark's gospel about they'll be bitten by poisonous snakes and not heal. Well, Paul's sort of a fulfillment of that. But he had the thorn in the flesh that God did not remove. And he acknowledges how God didn't remove it to keep him humble, so that he would continue to serve God as he should. And so we have to allow God to be God. Someone who is not in our control and doesn't hop to our orders as some celestial bellhop. But he knows what is best for each one of us. Whether for it's to be healed of a disease, or whether it's something that we have to carry on with us so that we can be faithful in our obedience to him, and that he can use us to his glory as we are his servants in this world, making a difference in it, and we're putting our hope for eternity. Every one of us is going to come to that point that we will face the grave. Whether it's something soon or something far away, whether it's by our last breath of a healthy life, or whether it's the gasping breath of a disease. We need to have a hope beyond the grave. And God had sent his son Jesus to give us that hope, who says, I want you to know that I can do the most amazing things because God's power is with me. And He has sent me here to tell me that He has compassion and love for me, and that He's going to give me the hope of eternity. And we carry that encouragement with us each and every day, so that we're not overcome by the worries and the worlds of this world, but we seek first the kingdom in His righteousness, and we let God unfold His plans in our lives that we might live with Him forever. Hope you've enjoyed our study together this morning, and I encourage you to join us again when we get back together. God bless you.